the real. The last part of this book is my favorite because he talks about empathizing with the child. There's these little scripts about dealing with a child's fears from the 1890s parenting perspective, understanding that a child needs sympathy hardly less than he needs love, he writes. Yet 10 children are loved by their parents where only one child has his parents' sympathy. And he defines this as really understanding what a child is feeling. Trumbull also talks about things we don't see elsewhere. He says that parents should be best friends with their children. They should really seek to cultivate that so that children will want to connect with them and tell them things. He has a whole passage where he kind of surveys the biblical mothers and talks about maternal tenderness. And he has almost a whole chapter where he talks about historical figures and quotes them talking about their mothers. So whether this is kind of like a little bit of Victorian elevation of the feminine or not, I'm not sure, but I definitely found it charming. I read this right after a week where in social media you had Joe Rigney and others talking about how empathy is sin. Oh, we need to rid the church of the feminine influence. And it was just such a marked contrast from here, this pastor kind of honoring the feminine influence as he saw it. When Trumbull's talking about sympathizing with children, I think he's saying to connect with your children and to guide them. So he is saying you can do these things to gain opportunity to help to direct your children as their friend, as someone who understands, so you can help them grow in the life they ought to take. So it is directive, but he does see it as an opportunity that is up to a parent to take or not. He basically says a child's going to look to someone for this kind of empathetic influence, and parents can look for the opportunity. He says, for instance, how the child ought to feel is one thing, how the child does feel is quite another thing. The parent may know the former better than the child does, but the latter, the child knows better than the parent. Until a parent has learned just how the child looks at any matter, the parent is incapable of so coming alongside of the child in his estimate of that matter as to win his confidence and to work with him toward a more correct view of it. Here are the fun things I saw sprinkled in here. But he talks about the importance of parents playing with their children as well. And he has a whole chapter on Santa Claus. I find it really interesting that back in 1890, you have this devout, by all accounts, of renowned leader talking about this and basically saying, actually, Santa Claus is good for Christian children because it helps retain kind of fancy and fairy worlds and delight around Christmas times. Oddly, when Elizabeth Elliot later is writing in Shaping of a Christian Family, which I'm going to do a few reels on, she cites Trumbull as the reason why her parents did not do Santa Claus. So I find that interesting, given that he has a whole chapter. There's one lovely, I think it's the closing chapter. Yeah, it's called Good Night Words, and it's quite lovely. He talks about the tenderness of going to bed. Other places he's spoken very tenderly about the fears of children, which really stuck out to me because I read this one the same day I read Dobson's, and Dobson gives an example of a child being afraid to go to bed, and so does Trumbull. And I might contrast them in a post, but he's just very kind about how parents think about leaving their children at the end of the day. I like how Trumbull phrases things as opportunity for parents, as the opportunity they could have, rather than things they must do or things if they don't do X, Y, and Z will happen, but an invitation, which again, circling back around to the opening, really does model respect for people's agency that he's held from the beginning and that has been woven throughout his approach. Anyway, all that to say, this was a refreshing read. I'm curious to read more from this era to see if he was unique or if this was kind of what was common in Christian parenting. And if you're interested, this is available to you to read, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.